Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Rod Bigelow. I am the director of Crystal Bridges, and I want to welcome you all to the Great Hall this evening. It's a beautiful evening in Bentonville. As this institution is dedicated to uniting American art and nature, Crystal Bridges is uniquely suited to host an exhibition of landscape painting. Picturing the Americas is particularly important because it's the first exhibition that examines the history of landscape painting across the Western Hemisphere. As Crystal Bridges is the only US venue, and we're very proud of that, we felt that it was important to take advantage of the rare opportunity to invite scholars from all across the Americas to come together here in the Ozarks to share their insights and foster discussion about art and nature across the geographic and cultural borders. This symposium is a perfect example of the type of partnership Crystal Bridges works to foster and build amongst its peers in the cultural community worldwide as we share collections, contribute to scholarship, and work together to foster the appreciation of American art across the world. We are very pleased to welcome distinguished scholars from across the Western Hemisphere who have come to Crystal Bridges to present at this symposium, as well as those who have traveled from around the world to join the discussion, beginning tonight with a lecture by Ivo Mesquita. Also note that we have budding art historians joining us tonight from the University of Arkansas, and they'll be with us for the next couple of days. So please make a point to find them first, and then introduce yourselves and encourage them to keep going in the history of the art history world. Please join me tonight in thanking our local sponsors who've made the exhibition possible, and in particular the Terra Foundation of American Art, which has generously sponsored this symposium. Thank you, Terra. We are very privileged to have the three curators of the exhibition back with us. They were here last week for the opening of the exhibition, and they're back to participate in the symposium. So please welcome PJ Brownlee from the Terra Foundation of American Art. PJ, you want to stand up? He's in the back. He's a little charged up. Valeria Piccoli from the Pinacoteca in Sao Paulo. And Georgiana Ujarek from the Art Gallery of Ontario. Thank you all for your dedicated work on this exhibition. And in addition, we are so grateful to have our own curator from Crystal Bridges, Mindy Besaw, who worked so hard to develop the exhibition here in Bentonville. Mindy, where are you? And finally, I'd like to thank our team member, Ali Demirosky, who has worked so hard to put together all the logistics and activity around this exhibition. Ali, when the weekend's over, you're going to be so excited. Stand up. So we are certainly indebted to the hard work of the curators and the organizing institutions of Picturing America. But none of this may have happened without the vision and inspiration of our speaker tonight. He has been developing the concept of this exhibition from the late 1980s, when he viewed paintings from Canada's Group of Seven in Manitoba, and was struck by the connections between that work, the work of those artists, and those of South America. Ivo Mesquita has been the artistic director, Pinacoteca, chief curator at the same institution between 2006 and 2012. He was researcher and assistant curator at the Sao Paulo Biennale Foundation for 8 years, co-curator of the 20th and 24th Biennale, and chief curator of the 28th. He was visiting professor for 11 years at the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College in New York, and director of the Museum of Modern Art in Sao Paulo in 1999. As an independent curator, he has contributed to projects for various international institutions and was the curator of the Brazilian Pavilion at the 1990 and 2009 Venice Biennales, and one of the curators of the binational Insight 97 and 2000 projects in Tijuana, Mexico. All that said, it is our very great pleasure to introduce Ivo Mesquita.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be. I have to install a lot of things here because I'm all connected. The papers. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very honored and pleased to be at this occasion at the Crystal Bridges. I would like to thank the museum for this invitation, for the opportunity to come here and to see the Picture in the Americas exhibition here, which is a very privileged occasion because it's seeing the works all together that for years I have been imagining how to put them together, but now this venue makes a difference because we have this wonderful Americana collection that you can see the same artists in a more extensive way in this house. You know? I also am very grateful to Terra Foundation because they support, they generous support, enthusiasm, and commitment since the very beginning. Our first conversation in São Paulo many years ago with Liz Glassman and PJ when they first came visiting us, and we came with this first conversation. It was very a wonderful collaboration. Also, it was very important for the Pinacoteca at the moment for establishing a partnership with Terra Foundation at the same time with the AGO, Art Gallery of Ontario, to make this project. You know? And the interesting thing is because I had this idea because I was curator, you know? But when this process started, they were in São Paulo and I was nominated director, so unfortunately I couldn't do the job, the curatorial job, but I would like to express my deepest gratitude for the three curators for the wonderful job they did in these 4 years preparing the show, you know. And also I'd like to thank you, the collaborators and contributors that are here for the symposium and for the publication, because the exhibition is great, but the publication is already an important reference in art history in this continent. You know? I have a little bit of long text, but I'll try to just explain. I was asked to talk a little bit, or to talk how I came into this idea, you know, and this is, as Rod said, I was in São Paulo Bienal, and working, my main experience is, despite my background in art history, I have been working with contemporary art since the very beginning when I start. While crossing across the American continent, traveling, you know, visiting art history was a kind of break of contemporary art, you know, and there I started imagining how to make this show. So what I'm presenting here is a sort of my story. I try to tell you a story about this experience, you know. Oh, it's not working? Oh, I have to do this. Oh, okay. Sorry. Ever since the Renaissance, traveling to temporarily journey along or through unknown places has played an important part in the training of artists and the professionalization of the art system. If at first this was mainly true for artists themselves, as time went by, this gradually became the norm for art historians, connoisseurs and conservators, dealers and collectors. In those days, one would travel to Rome, seat of the papacy and capital of the Christian world, to see the classical works of architecture and the sculpture of antiquity. The same city would eventually become a mecca for artists the world over up until the end of the 19th century, for with the passing of time, it accumulated in its churches, palazzi, and galleries not only the vestiges of classical culture, but also some of the greatest examples of the art of the Renaissance and Baroque. It was in the 17th century that the voyage to Rome was instituted as an instructional experience of paramount importance for the training of the artists when the French Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture decided to open the French Academy in Rome in 1666 in order to send there its most gifted students, the winners of the Prix de Rome, Roma Prize, created in 1663. This was a way in which to take them to the canon of Renaissance art and to cradle of modern humanism, to the cradle of modern humanism, putting them in touch with the works of the past masters so that they could see them, copy them, simply coexist with them. This also constituted a way in which the Academy sought to place the production of its own students as both development and fulfillment of the grandeur and the age-old tradition one could find in the city. These procedures served as a model for numerous academies creating the New World from the end of the 18th century onwards, which adopted not only European traditions and academic teaching methods, but also espoused salons, which had a prize residence program in Rome, Paris, or Madrid. It is from this training system that many of the artists, including picture in the Americas, emerged. It worth to be noted that this system was important not only for the instruction of 19th century artists, but also for that of modern artists. This is particularly clear when one looks at Latin America, where the great modernist masters are usually the result of a thorough academic training and an experience of residence abroad, more often in Europe, and where, for this very reason, the ones responsible for the aggiornamento, updating, and the renewal of their respective artistic and cultural scenes. But it was from the second half of the 17th century onwards that the habit of traveling, as we know it today, that is, as a leisurely activity, became part of the life of a certain class of people. It was during the Ancien Régime that the first English and later French aristocrats began what would later become known as the Grand Tour. It consisted of an educational trip to Italy, land of the art and philosophy of classical antiquity and the Renaissance, and the spring of the so-called European and humanist civilization, and would eventually become an indispensable part of the schooling of intellectuals and artists, or that of anyone who wished to play a prominent role in society, as Francis Bacon argued in 1615 in his essay of travel. It was an opportunity to study and familiarize oneself with the art and literature, ancient and contemporary history, trade and diplomacy, people and country, but in a free, non-academic manner, as they used to say, otium literarium sine studiorum, instructive leisure without disciplined study. These were journeys that lasted many months, were very expensive, and involved a group of people that included servants, tutors, and specialists in history, geography, and art, as well as local guides which were consequently planned and prepared in advance. They also gave rise to a number of publications dealing with the places visited and custom seen, as well as tips and pointers on how to travel and how to turn the journey into a productive and enriching experience. They recommend knowing the local language, keeping a journal, going to the theater and listening to music, rubbing shoulders with diplomats and prominent locals, patronizing bars and restaurants, participating in festivals and religious celebration are among some of the recommendations found in these books that still ring true today. In the 18th century, the age of reason, this habit spread throughout Europe and became an important part of the instruction of aristocrats and rulers, intellectuals and academics from Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, Austria, and Russia. Traveling gradually became a strategy for the individual improvement, for training on enlightened and cultural leadership in order to engender in people a full experience of themselves and the world surrounding them, nature, art, and history. The journey of the Grand Tour were true expeditions to the luminous seascapes of southern Europe, the Parnassus of the sweet hills of Rome and Tuscany, and offer a chance for the acquisition and commissioning works of art, furniture, objects, books, and documents for the collection of noble-blooded travelers and their families. It constituted a cultural exchange, experience, and created a cosmopolitan mindset for Europe, for the European elite, giving it a consciousness of itself as a dominant and hegemonic class, as well of its place in the historical and social register. As recommended by Montaigne, As recommended by Montaigne in 1580, I consider all men to be my countrymen, quote. Nationality must be subordinated to the universal and common bond of humanity, end of quote. Much of the material legacy of these journeys, of the taste and interest of its travelers, has found its way to museums and cultural institutions, public and private, where they can be seen today, especially in the Northern Hemisphere. In the same period, prompted by the spirit of enlightenment and colonial enterprise, we see the emergence of global scientific expedition, which aimed to map, understand, and order nature and the inhabitants of the so-called discovered land in America, Africa, and somewhat later in South Pacific. Springing from the scientific and humanist frame of mind that flourished in Europe from the second half of the 17th century onwards, these journeys were financed by colonial governments, trading companies, or wealthy adventurers interested in capitalizing on the available natural resources of the new territory. They brought together soldiers, cartographers, scientists, botanists, zoologists, geologists, astronomers, and naturalist artists who devoted themselves to the documenting of landscape, the fauna and flora, native inhabitants, and different ways of life by means of drawing and watercolor, as well as to the collection of plant, animal, insect, mineral, and fossil specimens. They also assemble objects and artifacts of material culture of the places visited. However, unlike the Ostium Literarium that guided the Grand Tour in the forays into the classical past of Europe, these expeditions were bound to a new world, both challenging and unknown. They could last years, and its participants were subject to all sorts of risks. Many who were part of this expedition perished from unknown diseases, exhaustion, or madness, in violent clashes with native shipwrecks, or still lost themselves amidst luxuriant jungles, mountains, glaciers, and remote islands or uncharted seas. But it is to the hands of this traveler that we owe the most magnificent images and accounts of a world as yet untouched by the hungry eyes of the Western civilization, documenting a unique experience that would never again be possible. Places, people, things that were being seen for the very first time, discovered. Nothing would be as before. Scientific collections and a multitude of objects and artifacts amassed by these expeditions, the journal entries, the notebooks and drawings produced during them, were eventually transformed into books, painting, and engravings that spawned a tremendous change in the Western imagination and widened the possibilities of travel and its destinations, as well as the illusion which were created by it. Art history itself, as an independent field of study, its classification and repertoire of reference is closely related to the long research journeys through the Italy peninsula and the Mediterranean coast undertaken by Johann Winkelmann, Jacob Burckhardt, Heinrich Wolfi, and Aby Warburg, some of the founders of the discipline. Connoisseurship can only be sustained because the historian or researcher has seen the work, the piece of architecture, has been in places and engaged with its landscape. It means it's life that is lived. The Napoleonic Wars interrupted the Grand Tour for they militarized frontiers, imposed border control, and prevented the free movement of people across the European continent. Once they were over, a new configuration of the nation-state was consolidated in Europe at the same time as the colonial cycle in the Americas was coming to an end. The period between 1804, the year of Haiti's independence, and 1825 saw the emergence of all the Latin American nations, with the exception of Cuba, which remained colony until 1898. The Romantic spirit, in turn, moved away from the humanistic principles guided by the objectivity of enlightened reason, the world order by the universal and common bond of humanity of the previous century, to the affirmation of the individual character guided by emotions brimming with exacerbated feelings, swaying between idealism and pessimism. Under different national flags, travel, due to the demand of colonial expansion into Africa, Middle East, Palestine, and the Ottoman Empire, was given a heroic meaning, adventurous, which sought after an encounter with the non-European other. Traveling, thus, moves beyond the borders of the Italian peninsula into Greece, Turkey, Egypt, and all North Africa, reclaiming and reasserting Europe's mythical and Mediterranean origins. Lord Byron, the archetypal poet of the Romantic spirit, and the painter Eugène Delacroix, master of the Orientalist imagery, are paradigmatic examples of the traveling colonial. Romantic artist, impassioned militant, engaged in a sensual experience of the world, but always assertive of the European civilization. If in one hand, traveling continued to represent the intellectual and the cultural polishing of a given person, on the other, it was the narrative of travelers that led still in the 19th century, to a large number of artists and adventurers going in search of contrasting experiencing or establishing themselves in distant loci and cultures seen as exotic. Poles apart from Western standards, abandoning the urban culture of metropolitan capitals to seek refuge in distant and contrasting places, apparently untouched by civilization or shrouded by mysteries and teeming with promises of redemption. Paul Gauguin is the best example of this modern, tormented artist, disenchanted with his time, who in this case goes looking for what he hopes will be his liberation in the South Pacific. But it was not to be, neither for him nor for many others of that time who fled the corrupt and mercantilist civilization of the Western world in search of a pristine and primitive refuge. Reality was not up to those dreams. Places such as they dreamed of no longer existed. But perhaps they never did exist, or only exist in the instant of the logical time, at the first glance. After the first moment, nothing could be as it is before, for desire is the desire of the other, teaches Lacan. Today, we know how devastating the meeting between Robinson Crusoe and Friday actually was, idealistic and romantic metaphor of colonialism that it is, the book is. Nevertheless, it is during the 20th century that traveling became a necessary experience in the career of the modern artist, especially among those living on the peripheries of both Europe and America. All sought to cross borders, infiltrate the other worlds, learn new visual vocabularies, incorporate diverse modes of living, engage with other artists and intellectuals in the belief that exceptional things were taking place in important cities and that it was necessary to experience them in loco. Newspapers, magazines, and all manner of publications available in the periphery made known what was happening and echoed the intellectual life of Paris, London, Milan, Berlin, and Madrid, keeping the peripheral centers tuned and updated, albeit with a time lag, with what was taking place in the heartland of Europe, art and ideas. This desire to update oneself prompted artists and thinkers to amass in their libraries all sorts of publications, magazines, books, catalogs, postcards, that supply them with information on what was happening on the other side of the Atlantic. These readings allowed them to establish an imaginary map, to plan an itinerary of things, and to do and places to see when the time finally came for the long-awaited journey into Europe. Definitely, what seemed important in the experience of this journey was the possibility of coming face-to-face with the European other, and through this confrontation, being able to see oneself and access what could be the way forward, forging along the way an original modern dialectical system. In this sense, whilst traveling gradually became part of modern life, history's many development during the 20th century, that is inherited of the Industrial Revolution, wars, revolutions, and the end of colonialism, the Cold War, produced a large number of migrant workers, expats, refugees, and professionals fleeing political persecution which were led by various circumstances to seek a new life in other lands. Among them were artists, writers, scientists, teachers, and technicians who transformed the human and intellectual landscape of the West and greatly contributed to the spread of international standards such as democracy, justice, and modernism. They bring this very notion the notion of extraterritorial define or apply itself not merely on contemporary literature, but pointed out this very same equality in architecture, design, fashion, cosmopolitan taste, film, music, and all branches of knowledge. Modern art, concrete, constructivist art, abstract, pop, conceptual, postmodern. In short, the whole 20th century art is an entity in its entirety. Construct and deconstruct is the result of a process of internationalization of the principle of a capitalist West, almost always carried out in centers and peripheries for the better or for the worse, by the fundamental contribution of immigrants and travelers. Be that as it may, apart from the pedagogical and educational recommendation, the intellectual polish and sensitive experience of the world made possible by journeys traveling today is part of our contemporary life. It is difficult to picture someone who has not traveled at least once for adventure, love, family, work, exile, pilgrimage. Traveling is one of the many metaphors for life itself, and our imagination is densely repopulated with narrative and archetypical representations where it functions as the means by which one fulfills one's destiny, the crossing over to the glory of conquest or to the failure of defeat, into exile or its overcoming. Traveling has played an ever-growing part in a nation's economy ever since the Englishman Thomas Cook organized the first trip for a group of people in 1840. A few years later, opened the first travel agency, predicting that travel would become more and more accessible with the growth of Europe's rail network. Tourism, traveling for leisure, has extended the notion of the formative aspect of travel to the children of the bourgeoisie everywhere, and has become an important strategy for culture in the 20th century. It follows, perhaps, that we can conceive of any trip as a transformative experience, not only as a means for the acquisition of knowledge and power, but as a different way of relating with time and space, since the normal life is temporarily suspended during a journey. However, Joseph Conrad's delicate fragment, in which he describes a game of chance and imagination over a map, a game that has been endlessly repeated by teenagers through time, is today only a literary reference, the expression of a romantic ideal, a utopia in our contemporary world, a blank space. The possibility of something waiting to be discovered, a transformative locus of our present condition. There are no blank spaces in the maps anymore. Everything has been scanned, charted, mapped, recorded, and put on the web. It's possible to browse the streets of major cities around the world, visit a multitude of museums, monuments, historical sites, Imagine an itinerary of all sorts on land, sea, or air. With stunning and error-free images, television documentaries make known to us all of the world's landscape, deserts, mountains, cities, forests, rivers, and oceans, as well as the customs and uses of its inhabitants. The tourism industry, for its part, transports hundreds of millions of people through all latitudes of the planet, but the vast majority of them, however, seems today to be seeking the comfort of the predictable, that which they always know or think they know, because they have read, heard, or seen it on television, the movies, or in the internet. They seem to want to abolish any possibility of risk, of estrangement, of confrontation with any kind of otherness. They reach the destination, shoot thousands of photographs, selfies, or record videos, and that's that. The documents that confirm that experience of the place according to the image one already has of it have been made, thus authenticating the prediction that both images should coincide. Travel seems to have gone from being a deeply subjective experience of the world to an objective one, standardized and repetitive. It's curious that museums, particularly art museums, are among the most sought after, the most prestigious and valued products of this industry. The imagination produced by these travelers is available on the web, yet its creativity is still to come. Since the 90s, last century, we have seen the emergence of a number of artistic productions that attempt to deal with the experience of otherness, as well as with socialization and inclusion by means of specific strategies amidst the multifarious segments and process of a globalized artistic circuit. This make use of the experience of traveling as part of a cultural exchange strategy that offers residence programs, projects of site-specifics, developed in collaboration with local artists and distinct communities the world over. Paintings, drawing, books, installations, documents, film, files, archives, photos, videos, films, objects, and installations features portraits, landscape, practice and customs, and retrieve local narrative and memories, linking them with the cultural political debate in the context of globalization. Thus, these productions have greatly contributed to the expansion of the territory of the visual arts by resorting to disciplines such as anthropology, sociology, literature, and history. Regardless the specific issues tackled by each of these productions, more or less poetic or ideological, this practice in general attempt to discuss the experience with the other, the confronting and coping with difference, with difference, the effort of communicating and exchanging. They are not looking for something foundational, primal, as artists and scientists did during their journey between the 17th and 19th centuries, but rather a new relation with time and space and the expansive rearticulation of artistic practice. It's a new traveling condition for the artist's work in face of new political and economic demands made for his cultural and social integration into the contemporary world. I would like to make an observation about this topic. In the middle of the second decade of this century, we are witnessing the growth of a new involuntary traveler that crushingly reveals a cruel and overwhelming reality of the human condition. The encounters with an ever-expanding number of anonymous migrants made to leave their places of origin, excluded from their territories due to the lack of basic living conditions and job opportunities. They are, on one hand, the million of workers recruited and or expelled from their poor and underprivileged countries that still live without any basic human rights, in subhuman or even slave-like conditions, with no perspective of ever becoming anything other than someone else's labor or workforce. I'm talking about this workers in the Middle East, for instance. On the other hand, the thousands of refugees, victims of wars, revolutions, arbitrary violence, and the persecutions of all sorts, looking for a place to survive, to begin anew, but that seem doomed to live into a no man's land under the aegis of the philanthropy of international organizations. Both are victims of the expansion of capitalism, the concentration of capital, and globalization in incessant power games. They roam from, with a varying degrees of visibility, the latitude of our planet, and they will almost certainly never be given the opportunity to go to a museum. I think that all began when I was 11 years old and visited Rio de Janeiro for the first time. It was at the National Museum of Fine Art that I first had the experience that formed the basis for my love of art and museums. It was a painting. The Last Tamoio by Rodolfo Amoedo. This was the artwork that was to stay with me forever. Clearly, in 1962, I did not have the insight regarding the meaning of this painting or of art that I have today. 50 years have passed since that I first looked, but what I have learned since that experience has not had so much to do with the painting itself, the artist, or its historical context. Rather, it has involved what this painting and the entire domain to which it belongs have taught me about myself as a subjectivity, as an individual, a citizen, and about where the transformative, liberating part of art resides. The scene depicted in the painting, a sort of pietà, represents a cleric cradling the body of a naked Indian lying dead at a seashore at the end of an overcast and gloomy day, as conveyed by the narrative atmosphere. The painting's theme refers to an episode of Brazil's colonial history, a war fought around 1560 between the Portuguese colonizer and the Tamoios indigenous, who refused to be enslaved. The war wound up decimating this tribe, and about 300 years later, the occurrence was used as a theme of the epic romantic poem of great success in time, The Confederation of the Tamoios, by Gonçalves de Magalhães. This literary reference was the inspiration for Amoedo's doing this painting in Paris, while he was in residence by the Brazilian Academy. Just to understand, following Brazil's independence in 1822, the most common theme in Brazilian art and literature was the construction of national identity, the post-colonial Brazil character, which I think it happened everywhere. So it's interesting that today there's all this talk, this debate about post-colonialism, but I think it's not the case of the Americas. The post-colonial for us is 19th century. You know? We We are not, okay, done. This gave rise to the so-called indigenous movement, which dominates the 19th century artistic mindset in the country and was aimed at speculating about and constructing a representation of the Brazilian as a mythical race, the product of the miscegenation between the noble American savage and the civilized colonizer from Europe. In this way, a slave society was perversely reflected in the indigenous purity and in the Western Enlightenment thinking in order for that society to cast a blind eye on the conflictive elements of its condition, its place. For me, the question was of another order. Not knowing about the narrative or the literature concerning the painting, what impressed me as a student in an all-boys Jesuit school was the nudity of the heroic body in counterpoint to the totally clothed cleric who cradled him in a Christian manner. Regardless the epic and moral sense of this narrative, the most evident thing is the eroticism of the depiction, which is strongly present despite the conventional epic nature of its composition. In other words, The Last Tamoio provoked me something that I would only understand many years late upon reading and studying the scopic drive and the theory that art as a product of sublimation based on Sigmund Freud text, Leonardo da Vinci and the Memory of His Childhood. It's from 1909, 1910. For me, that image freed my imagination as a projection, a fantasy. And in the museum, there were more audacious and disturbing images of that kind, which until that moment I had been prevented from seeing at home and at school by the censorship of films, books, and magazines as unsuitable for a child's eye. And yet, there they were for my solitary contemplation in a solemn and silent setting where the few visitors were free to gaze at them without interruption or any sort of admonishment. I was free to look in amazement at those paintings from the past at the helm of beauty, which, although they did not look like real photographic images of the same sort, still managed to be just as unsettling and provocative. I filled me with an immense and previously unknown feeling of freedom. 7 years later, after that revealing experience with art and the discovery of the museum as a place without censorship in 1969, I experienced my first trip to Europe, and the first museum I visited was the Prado in Madrid. It was still the Franco dictatorship period, and the museum was not that popular as it is today. Therefore, it was possible to stroll around, almost isolated, like in a labyrinth, and find well-known masterpieces, besides things like this beautiful Guido Reni, and Atalanta and Hippomenes, that became a companion since then. However, despite my deep interest and commitment to art history from the past, my academic background and professional practice was forged by the contemporary art. São Paulo is a wealthy, industrial immigrant city with a sophisticated cultural infrastructure and programs, with a wonderful art museum. It has as well a traditional and important international biennial exhibition since 1951, which means art, artists, and curators regularly traveling into the country and bringing other experiences and practice, open new imaginary. If there is some development that we can call unforeseen in the realm of the museum, it was the boom of contemporary art, how it was converted in the art center into a spectacle within the economy of the exhibitions, dethroning the blockbuster shows of masters of classical art and modernism, which it has also been surpassing in terms of price and value. It was something practically inconceivable for my generation, educated in the 70s. There was no consistent circuit for the emerging artists' production at that time. They had not only, the artists, they had not only to make their art, but also create conditions for exhibiting their works, inserting them into a cultural circuit. It required generosity, idealism, and great deal of libidinal investment when we compare into the current totally professionalized scene today, well-organized relations of production, a powerful and institutionalized economy. Certainly, there was something underway at pioneering museums such as the Stedelijk in Amsterdam, or the Moderna Museet in Stockholm, the Kunsthalle in Bern, Contemporary Art Museum in São Paulo, among many others, which had an expressed commitment with the promotion of contemporary art that was more advanced and experimental, as it was described at that time. But it was after the opening of Beaubourg in Paris, 1976, that this process seems to have accelerated, becoming large-scale with intense mediatic visibility. It transformed the institutional scene, brought new public to the museum, and created new valuable services. Up to then, museums were, above all, a conservatory responsible for collecting and preserving the nation's material and symbolic heritage, representing its highest degree of wealth, power, development, and civilization. They were assigned the role of recovering the accelerated time of progress that which would have been destroyed or sacrificed for the sake of the constantly new. In the late 70s, however, this museum had to adapt itself to a new reality imposed by the growing awareness of the importance of the present time, the daily life. Alongside this, the change in the orientation of art criticism and academic debates proposing revisions of the art history or the canonical interpretation, proposing alternative narrative with new selections or ordering for museums' collection, allowed for the rise of other methods for presenting artistic production, of new critical framework, reference, and conceptual structure, which transformed and expanded the role of art collections and exhibitions. Therefore, a potent circuit with high investment was created for contemporary art, biennials, art fairs, residence program, among other strategies. And they all happened in different latitudes around the world, becoming something associated to travels. Today, the public wants to understand the signs that point to the newest, the most recent developments, the manifestation of personal and original words, just like themselves as individuals who photograph themselves at every moment and post on the social networks. In a society centered by the media, people want to consume and be part of a great event. It seems then that the museum visitor wants to experience the future even before it takes place. Art became part of the entertainment industry, and in the culture of the spectacle, the museum, the exhibition, the biennial are respectable spectacles. We have fun while believing we are educating ourselves. In any case, the present moment is one of optimism. Not so much because of the generalized success of museums as a top product in the culture and tourism industry, which for better and worse become very significant everywhere. Certainly, the existence of a circuit of globalized art museum is an outcome of the growth of the economy as a whole worldwide. But at the same time, due to an inequality between local economies, many of them still operate on an artisanal pre-industrial scale. What matters is how they affirm themselves at every moment as an essential apparatus for any project of basic and collective education, how they could respond in light of the pressing needs of our society and the need to educate and raise awareness among individuals in order for them to think critically and fulfill their role as citizens. Art is no longer a theme in its own right. It has been transformed into a commentary or mirror of contemporary themes such as minority issues, traumatic memories, or social conflicts. The museums themselves have begun to commission artworks on various themes. In this way, the thematic exhibition no longer underscores the museum's property and pertinence in light of history, but rather its utility and social function, revealing this society's degree of awareness about itself. This shift from aesthetic contemplation to the assimilation of the contents of art has created new social and programmatic demands for the museum, enlarging its function. Now, it should be didactic and educational, in a wide sense and accessible. It should engage communities and be popular, be political and socially active, and, above all, it should serve the patrons and the sponsors who are now making it economically viable. Today, the visual arts circuit or system constitutes a powerful economy sector with a sophisticated contingent of professionals and technical staff with salaries paid by resources arising from fiscal laws that encourage philanthropy by individuals and marketing by corporations. Therefore, the confrontation in the museum territories no longer take place around the production of experience and knowledge. Rather, they concern with the achieving goals and indicators with a view to financial and fiscal control, the optimization of investment, and cost reduction. A mode of capitalism, business-oriented production, is proposed for the experimental work of research, reflection, and education. Numbers and percentage are the main indicators of results which are measured annually, analyzed, compared, evaluated. They influence and are reflected in the determination of policies and the strategies, causing eventual changes, of course, for the organization that work with visual perception and education. Sorry, I have to read this again. They influence and are reflected in the determination of policy and the strategy, causing eventual changes in the course of organization that work with visual perception and education. It seems that there is no possibility of interest in the qualitative criteria. But the question is, even though they are under continuous scrutiny, are the museum fostering a more knowledgeable and aware public, a more visible, visually educated population, sitting with heightened responsibility, who are committed to their time and place? Apparently, they are not. This cultural consumption, organized with a greater efficiency, does not favor the democratization of arts so often stated as a goal, or even worse, it actually lowers the citizen's responsibility. The visitor is told not only what he/she should look at, everything that considered a must-see, but it's also inculcated by way of an efficient didactic arsenal in regard to how she should look at the artwork. Everyone becomes adapted to the prevailing conditions of production. The sponsors need the museum for the social insertion of their image or brand. The museum needs the public for its financial and ideological legitimacy. The public needs the museum as a delegate authority of knowledge and culture. In this system, the museum runs in the terrible risk of being guided by the lines of the market, which tends to promote the qualities of a formal intelligence above those of individual experience, of imagination, of subjectivity, which by means of art can be made to flourish in each individual. The historical development of the museum has always been accompanied by the criticism of them, but with a variety of arguments. We never speak of the same museum if we consider the various generations that have passed through it. Nevertheless, with the transformation of the museum into hubs of tourism industry, their services have become more important than the objects they custody. The happening is more challenging than the expertise. Cultural heritage has become the theme of the cultural industry, just as the cultural heritage industry has become the new mode of cultural production. Is this conception of the museum and its services the institution's future? To what point can we believe in the same effectiveness of this new economy, which drives the already existing museum and creates new ones? Are they still producing imagination, promoting creativity? I believe that the museum's future lies not in a new form of tourism, but rather in a new definition of content, which allows more space for contemplation and knowledge, seeking to foster a critical public, unlike the mass of people avid for sensation. There is not wrong with the fact of having constructed cathedrals for the artists, place for the rituals of culture, but they should be a place of silence and reflection. Moreover, they should be spaces set apart from the noisy world of the spectacle of culture, from the ceaseless flow of the information networks, from the rhetoric of the corporative capital. What we have to offer is a product of the highest quality, and our goal should always be to contribute to the consumer's spiritual and intellectual improvement. The conclusion is that it would be best to seriously assume the role of the art museum as a place for art, and this is not a tautology. The meaning of art can only be developed, incremented, and advanced when the symbolic institutional space is engaged and coexists with art from the past. The museum cannot be legitimated only through the incorporation of the contemporary artistic practice by the demands of the circuit in which it is inserted. Art needs to point to its own genealogy in order to materialize any meaning it might have. One of the museum's most beautiful tasks is precisely that of guaranteeing the presence of art, ensuring the visibility of artworks that have already been made. For its part, the globalized world offers the unique opportunity for us to form a new conception of ourselves through the experience of difference and otherness. But this is also the necessary condition for the installation of a dialogue, of an exchange with other creative practices and cultures. This process had come hand in hand with a geographical opening that produced more than a widening of a, in a geographical opening that produced more than a widening of our field of vision, more than a simple displacement of poles of interest. It put into question the established frontiers of art world, namely the frontiers of the developed Western world. Thus, the local museum remains as the incorporate of local traditions and cultures, not as a museum of folk and popular tradition, but as a privileged space of debates between the local and the global. We should understand that even the notion of Western implies a local character, notwithstanding the effort of modernism to propose and implement a universalizing project. Business people and ideologues can argue about the fact that we are headed toward the global village, but the museum should be left outside of this, standing alone like a parochial church. What is the advantage of a globalized museum if the types of museums that can be reached physically or virtually exist everywhere in the world, reproducing themselves from one to the next? It is not, therefore, the objects collected, but rather the activities of the museum that can define its future. This is not a question of only producing increasingly attractive spectacular exhibitions with the aim of increasing the number of visitors. More important, we need to determine if you want to enlarge or change the notion of the museum and the exhibition, or if we can conceive and propose enriched notions of them never attempted before. In any case, we must be very careful about the spectacular nature of the exhibition because, above all, this is aimed to a wide and indiscriminate public, an abstract entity at the center of the official policies for culture and the sponsorship. It is possible, therefore, to offer the public an alternative role? What would be it? By raising this issue and concerns, my aim is to present a challenge, posing a question that perhaps does not have an answer. But yet, have we exhausted traditional questions about collection, education, service, temporary shows, publication, financial resources, sustainability? The important thing is not to continue, is to continue asking and keep things moving. What we cannot do is to stop talking and not doing, but to stop doing. In its short history, the museum has already changed a lot and continues to change without this process having destroyed or weakened the institution. The museum is not different from the society that finances it and puts it into movement. The museum is a medium of knowledge, and does not exist apart or in opposition to its use. A medium, what for? It seems to say for art no longer serves for the general terms that it defines. The museum as a medium, if understood as such, will only be legitimated as an antipode to the mass communication media. It invites us to engage in experience of things and places. It offers us the possibility of constituting memory and recall. But it also invites us to intervene in the current technologies and not to simply interact with them. It also seems that the museum can take other roles, different from those it has played up to now. If you accept this premise, this allows us to continue with the challenge of seeking new roles for the museum and for what we professionals in this field can do with it. Museums cannot accept to live with to live a given created reality, but instead they must be a place for organizing a new negotiated reality. Thank you very much.